Welcome. Welcome to the first panel of the SPAS Graduate Council. My name is Tae-Ung Baik, Director of the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii-Manoa, and I'm also a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law. I'm very glad to moderate today's first session that is focused on societal changes across Asia. We have four brilliant speakers and future scholars who will deliver very interesting presentations today. Today, each of the panelists will present about 15 minutes, for about 15 minutes. After all presentation is finished, we will start discussions and Q&As. While the presentation is going on, however, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. And later on, if time permits, some of you might be able to ask questions in person though. Our first speaker is Ms. Elodie Lormel from University of Bordeaux, Department of Anthropology and Ethnography. Elodie is a master's student at the University of Bordeaux in the Department of Social Science, and I think focused on
join the meeting.
I'm sorry? Yeah, anthropology and ethnography is her area, I think, and she specializes in Korean studies there. Elodie's current research focuses on the development of Korean medicine in France and transnational circulation of knowledge, both on and offline. And I read her abstract, which is very interesting content. And her topic of a presentation today is Korean medicine in France, circulation of knowledge and global health. Ms. Lormel, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you very much for this introduction. It was very kind. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be part of this year's International Graduate Conference. And a special thanks to Hannah Cole and Kimberly Leach for their always swift and very kind responses to my emails. Today I will present my research and I will share my screen right now. Okay. If you have any question on the French context, I know it can be a bit tricky, or on my own pronunciation, because I am not a native speaker. So please feel free to ask away. So today I will present my researches on Korean medicine in France, which challenges the notions of body, health, and care through an ethnographic study of training courses and methods of acquiring knowledge in France in Korean medicine. As it is still an ongoing project, I will primarily talk today about working on complementary or traditional practices in the French health markets and how the concepts and questions emerging from interview with Korean medical practitioners are constitutive of my own anthropological reasoning. When I first, and this is the overview of the presentation. When I first started to work on this project, I hypothesized that South Korean place in Europe and the French health market should primarily be viewed as through the lens of soft power dynamics. This reasoning was based on Eric Bidet's study on Korean cultural politics from the early 1990s, as well as peaceful relationship between South Korea and France since 1886. Korean gastronomy, music, movies, and dramas are increasingly popular in France. As Korean restaurants invested the capital, K-dramas and movies are similarly flooding French Netflix. These shows could be seen as a window on traditional care as it plays in the background of numerous characters' lives. Most of Korean medical practitioners that went to South Korea in order to get trained shared to me that and stressed out numerous times that South Korean gastronomy was one of the most memorable things that they witnessed during their training. Social drinking and eating being two things that French and Korean people could share a love of, marked in their discourse, as we just started the interview, a way to put the two countries on equal footing. One of the doctors spoke at length on the subject, all talking about all of the other places he'd been to and visited and lived where it lives. I traveled, he said, quite a bit, you know, and always miss French food. But here in Korea, the food is so tasty and so varied that I never miss French food. Food in France is home. Thus, I found it quite a bit interesting that during the interview, the medical practitioners were willingly being translated or identified as Korean. As I received requests for anonymizing names in my dissertation by transcribing them in Hangul, I realized that identity in acquiring knowledge could have constituted its own subject. During this study, I worked with about 10 medical practitioners in and out of hospitals, the majority of which were also teaching Korean medicine in private schools. The idea was and is to map out the subject through a series of exploratory semi-structured interviews that would allow questions and paradoxes to surface. During these interviews, I tried to understand their view of the practice as well as how Korean medicine techniques are developed, maintained, and taught in a country with no Korean diaspora and an enforced biomedical monopoly. In 2013, the World Health Organization published Traditional Medicine Strategy, a report focusing on the relevance of traditional medicine and establishing guidelines for its stabilization. The goal was and is to develop an academic curriculum designed by the WFME, World Federation of Medical Education, and to increase clinical testing. Traditional medicine is perceived as an inexpensive and effective practice that should be integrated into any national health system as part of whose main priority of health for all. Korean medicine is particularly interesting to study as it has a well-perfected academic curriculum. In France, although European guidelines on traditional medicine dating 1999 stressed the importance of welcoming traditional practices at university, most traditional medical training are done in separate and private schools, none of which are recognized by the state. Stuart Hall, in developing on Salman Rushdie's idea of translated subject, wrote, "Those who are translated make a home in the interstices of the word." The negotiating of the subject is particularly relevant for traditional medical practice in France. The French health market is primarily characterized by a strict biomedical monopoly from an old polemical tradition which is bound to a specific type of knowledge. Any diversion of meaning are to be preempted and feared, which was what wrote Michel Alliot on Working of the Doctors. Sujok practitioners, in particular, feared for their anonymity in this project, as it was perceived as their only shield against the law. The medical practitioner faces on emails, phone interview, and video calls to the need to remain anonymous. La profession médicale, or the medical trade, is deeply rooted in a confrontation against what was called charlatanism, harmful of empirical practices that put the French public in danger. After the French Revolution, in order to fight the medical monopoly, the Ancien Régime opened the medical profession to anyone who could pay for it, pay a patent, thus opening the medical trade to fierce competition. As the number of charlatan and dangerous eccentric practice rose, the government voted the reinstatement of the legal practice of medicine according to a criteria of expertise. This criteria of expertise became steadily more strict until November 30, 1892, where only an education at university completed by a thesis could give out the title of doctor. To put it quite plainly, biomedical doctors are protected by the name and economic status of their profession. According to the Public Health Code, only members of the medical professions are allowed to diagnose and treat illnesses. Other practices are regarded as illegal and therefore punishable by 2 years of incarceration and up to 30,000 euros of fine. In a sense, doctors are sacred. Complementary parallel or traditional medicine practice in France should therefore negotiate their place in the market of health so as to not endanger the trust in the medical monopoly. However, as the general public's dissatisfaction with treatments and or desire to prefer natural or non-invasive solutions to pharmaceutical products grows, unconventional medicine will need to be allowed a sustainable status. A few training programs are recognized by the HAS or the DDS and open to train medical profession which can practice traditional medicine in hospitals. This is a case for a course given by the EMSP in the school, which is fairly affordable, about €1,000 a year. Two types of courses are given. One labeled as tout public, so for anyone. It is 3-level training and thus 3 years training that cumulate about 70 hours of class without accounting for personal work, internship, and a personal dissertation in final year. The second type of training course is only available to licensed medical practitioners, such as doctors, chiropractors, nurses, or midwives. It is composed of 2 levels of training, each 32 hours, and focuses on pain management without drugs. The teacher of the EMPS work primarily on the course with Université Hospital of Dijon and the Department of Oncology. As the nursing staff, doctors, and patients are made more and more aware of its efficiency, a certain frustration appears in view of the French government's unwillingness to recognize Korean medicine whilst taking advantage of its benefits, forcing Korean medicine practitioners to continue to evolve in legal uncertainty, while the practitioners push biomedical doctors to publish more and more on the subject. The South Korean government enforced policies to promote Korean medicine as soon as from 1994 through the foundation of the Institution of Oriental Medicine and of the School of Oriental Medicine in 2007, but it was earlier in the 1950s that it began. In Southeast Asia, South Korea is positioning itself as a reference point in the teaching and promoting of traditional medicine by publishing numerous research papers, some in collaboration with American universities, organizing conferences on world traditional medicine, such as the Expo, celebrating the 400th anniversary of the Donggye in 2013. Publications regarding the WHO and WFME guidelines are particularly interesting as they expose how imposing Western frames for education would endanger the essence and logics of traditional practice. Korean researchers are suggesting to rework Western codes and reshape global traditional medicine education under the sign of solidarity in traditional practice. South Korea has proven through international agreement and subscription to intergovernmental organizations such as the OECD, Organization of Economics, Cooperation and Development, that there is a common perception of global development. The OECD's strict entry policy approved only 37 nations, including South Korea, the United States, and France. The same organization recognized the extraordinary management of the COVID crisis by the peninsula. The values promoted by the OECD are at the core of health politics in France, as they appear in the introduction of the Note de Synthèse, which is concerning parallel medicine, a document summarizing health problematic and more for the Prime Minister and the Department of Homeland Security. By working through internation agreements, sharing similar values and views of dynamics of health and development, and questioning the domineering codes of practices that would endanger its specificity, South Korea is not only negotiating a place in the global field, but imposing itself as maybe a new standard and a reference for traditional practice. This could be achieved not only through soft power, but also thanks to extremely competent scholars and professors that were able to challenge biomedical knowledge on health and care in private schools and at university, and giving out free training for French practitioners in Korean medical hospitals, as it was discovered through interviews. In 2006, Dr. Kyung Byung-hee from Kyunghee University went to La Sorbonne and in order to give a talk on the subject of Sasan medicine and Tae-Ung acupuncture. For example, Korean medicine taught in traditional Chinese medicine private school in France is taught by doctors fully trained in South Korea. During the interviews, we stressed out the importance of specificity of Korean medicine's practice, inherited from traditional Chinese medicine. According to one of them, Korean medicine kept its singularity by opening later than other Southeast Asian countries to international trade. Thus, Korean medical practice is deeply rooted in tradition, while evolving and developing new methods and technologies for health. Sharing modern values for global progress while staying rooted and true to tradition, maybe it's what could be perceived and viewed as the defamation of home. In conclusion, it is customary for French-Korean studies to build a subject around a historiographic discussion with specific focus on the importance of culture and linguistics during data analysis. However, it can be argued that this particular study should also be viewed as a political anthropological subject. South Korea is to be considered a stakeholder in global health issues. Thus, in future research on the development of Korean medicine in France, this topic will be studied in a socio-anthropological way and will explore its effect on health politics worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Would you please stop sharing? Yes. Oh, this is really fascinating presentation and paper. When I was thinking about this topic, I immediately started to think whether there is a Korean medicine separately existing differently from Chinese medicine. And I did a little bit of Google search and I found that South Korea had developed some type of their medicine, but realized that each country actually have a traditional medicine. So the point now I learned was not whether there is a traditional medicine or not. The real point is how to combine those traditional medicine or other way of living with a modern type of new technology and others. Kind of development, and this is really fascinating subject, how to coexist with the old as well as new. And thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I learned a lot. And if you have any questions, audience, please type the questions in the chat box, and we continue after all of the presentation is done. Thank you very much. You did a great job, Ms. Lormel.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Shibin from Rutgers University. Shibin is a PhD candidate of the Department of Public Policy and Administration at the Rutgers University, Camden. His research interest includes eldercare, comparative public policy, policy evaluation, and community-based long-term care. Today, the topic of presentation is a care regime in China and India through the lens of elder care. This is a very interesting comparative study. Mr. Yan, will you go ahead?
Yes, thank you for the introduction, the chair. Right now, I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see the screen? Okay. All right. Now, today I'm going to present the topic, the care regime in China and India through the lens of eldercare. Actually, that's also the, my dissertation topic. And right now, in this presentation, I'd like to share with you in 5 areas: the background, objective, methodology, findings, and discussion. And before we go into the content, I actually want to introduce the concept of care regimes. I think that's very important to know about the definition, and because it's a rather brand new concept and it's very important. And based on Simonazzi's definition in 2009, is defined as the way in which the financing and provision of the care are organized in various nations and systems. The concept is similar with the concept of welfare regime, but is a little different. It pays more attention to the interplay between the 3 sectors: the markets, family, and the and the state, and also their settings and characteristics. So keep that in mind. And then why this issue is so important to study. There are 2 very important reasons. The first one is because there's an increasing number of older adults in both nations. And as we know, population aging is a global trend in the 21st century, but that issue is much pronounced in China and India. Based on the Chinese census, we can know that the number of people aged 60 and over was 228.8 million in 2017, which is account for 16.3% of total population. And it will also increase to 478 million by 2050. And in the meantime, when we look at the Indians' elderly population, the number was 125.6 million in 2017, and it will definitely go up to 316 by 2050. So we can see that the care demand caused by the increasing aging population will definitely challenges the long-term care practice and long-term care policies in those 2 countries. So that is a big concern for those 2 countries. Another reason is the unsustainability of the family line care model that those countries are using. That's because as China and India right now are experiencing the decline fertility rate, the demand for the eldercare service are increased dramatically, and the gap between the demand and the supply is very big. So this is a very big concern for those 2 countries to offer the care service to the elderly. And the social and democratic transformation in China and India have made the family line care models as unsustainability. So that require the formal care to provide more and more service and funding into the long-term care system and to is elder people. So the formal care need to play a bigger role in this. So based on those 2 reasons, we can see a successful or long-term care initiative need to have a better understanding the relationship between the state, family, and the market, also and the effect of that relationship on the care regime. so this is why we need to do this kind of study to compare the care regime in China and India. All right, let's go to next slide is the choice of the China and India. So there are three considerations on why I choose to do that in China and India. The first one is the similar challenges based on, because they are right now have increasing number of the elder population and they decry fertility rate, and also they have increased the life expectancy at birth. So they will face the the real concern in the near future. And the second reason is right now the China and India are in the similar process of industrialization and urbanization. Those two processes will drive those young people to migrate to the to the urban area for the better job opportunities. So in this case, that will leave their their elder parents behind in a rural area without the sufficient care. So that will be change the all the local care structure in a very short term. And the last reason is the rural elderly, because based on the literature, we can know that the majority of the elderly in the both nations are actually living in the rural area. And right now, the care system in the rural area is underdeveloped in both nations. So how to deliver the care resources and service to the elderly in the area is a very, very big issues for them, for those two countries' governments. So in this paper, we are going to try to achieve two goals. The first is to identify the typology of the care system in both nations, and then to examine how those effect of different typology on the socio-economic developments. This is two goals the paper want to achieve. And then next slide is about the methodologies. And this is the most important section in this paper. In my research, I'm using the Aspin-Anderson's welfare regime models. In 1999, Anderson is classified the welfare regime into three categories based on the quality of the social rights, social stratification, and the relationship between the state, market, and family. So there are three categories in here. We can see the first one is a liberal, care regime. In this category, if you pay more attention into the market force, use the market force to offer the service, but if you have the lower level of the state interventions. And the second one is conservative. And in this category, we can see if the family is play a major role to offer the service to the elderly, and the state will offer the necessary and limited service to the elderly when needed. And the last one is the social democratic. And in this one, the state will play the major role to offer the service. And if you emphasize the universal care, and if you ask the government to provide more coverage of the service and to the elderly populations. So this is the care regimen, and the data I'm using here is from the WHO SAGE dataset. It's also called the Study on the Global Aging and Older Adults, and is the longitudinal multidisciplinary study. And if you correct all on the data on the elder people aged 50 years and over in China, Ghana, India, Russia, and Mexico, and South Africa. So by using this data, I can identify about 14 variables to use to measure measure the care regimes. I also put them into category, the informal care and formal care. For the informal care, I use the share of the informal care and the hours informal care and the share of the care for the activity for daily life to measure the utilization of the informal care. And for the formal care, I use the three areas to measure the leave arrangements, financing, and support. The last one is the service. So we can see that by using this index system, I'm going to try to measure which typology that China and India that belongs to. And the next slide, I would like to talk about the findings. Based on the the calculation and this and the descriptive statistics I have, and by using the data, we can see that in China it appeared based on the table in the right, we can see that in China the formal care will provide more service to the elderly than is informal care. Although the family is continue to play a very important role in providing the elder care service, but the state and the market have become more influence in this and provide more service and fundings in the healthcare system. And based on the literature, we can know that the public sector, especially the state, is playing a leading role in this to offer the service. So it is consistent with the fact that in China, the state control the most of the funding and resources as well. So the characteristic of high public resources and spending, we categorize the China into the social democratic model. So in this model, the family operate as the social joe to offer the necessary assistance to the elderly population. When we talk about the Indians care regime model, is another story because Indians more rely on is private sector to provide the care service. We can see from the table the value of the index of informal care is lower than that of the formal care. So that means the formal care offer more funding and to the elderly service. And according to the literature we have, the market sector is playing a leading role in offer the service and the funding to the elderly population, and also the a lot of the healthcare providers in India are also is also the private sector or private hospital or private long-term care facilities. So compared to the private sector, the influence in of the state in India is very limited because the lack of funding of the government and also the bureaucratic efficiency, and also in India, because the Indians privatization process and also the rules and regulation that encourage the private sector to play a bigger role to offer the service to them. About the change, very interesting finding because right now in Western countries is transferred from more rely on the family rather than the formal care like the state and market to offer the service. But in India and China, they try to more rely on the family, more rely on the state and the market, that kind of formal care providers to offer the service. So they are transferred from the more rely on the informal care to formal care. So this is the final thing I want to share. And then in here, I want to discuss the social effect of the care regime. That's another goal of this presentation. And based on, because the time is limited, so I will focus on the first one.
Would you please try to wrap up soon?
Yeah, I will do that. Thanks for the reminder. Because of the care regime is different, so they have different effect on the on the social the social sector. So like we can see that the rural urban health disparity is different, because in India is using the liberal model, so it's more rely on the market sector to offer the service. So if you have a high risk of the widen the health disparities. But when we look at the Chinese cases, we can see when China is more rely on the state to offer the service, and it also emphasizes the coverage of the care service. So I think that disparity can be managed and controlled. So that's a little difference we can observe based on the the social effect of the care regimes. So I think that's all that I want to share. Thank you for listening. If anyone have any question or comments, please reach out to me. Thank you. Thanks for the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yan. It's fascinating to hear about the similarities and some differences between China and India. Would you please stop sharing the slide?
Yes. I'm doing it.
Yeah, I think China and India have a different social systems that probably will influence the elder care system as well. And I was initially thinking that because China is a socialist country, those two countries could be greatly different in many ways. But it's very interesting to see, even if with some characteristics, still more kind of elder care similarity exists in terms of elder care system. But on all those specificities that you are addressing is very interesting. I'm sure you will get questions later from our audience. So thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Next and last speaker will be from the University of Hawaii-Manoa, Ms. Laura Becker, who is a Master of Art student in sociology at the University of Hawaii. And her current research uses qualitative content analysis of South Korean progressive and conservative newspapers to examine the framing of digital sexual crime and the implications for women's movement. The title of Laura's presentation is Women's Rights Are Human Rights, Activists' Implementation of the Transnational Human Rights Framework Against Sexual Violence in South Korea. As a human rights lawyer and a scholar, I'm very glad to hear Laura's presentation today. And this will be also a very interesting topic because South Korea has seen a lot of movement these days, emphasizing feminist perspective as well as human rights perspective, dealing with violence against women. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. And thank you to the organizers of this conference for all of your wonderful work. And it's been great to hear from people from outside of our university. I'm at University of Hawaii-Manoa. I'm in the sociology department. And normally it would be really great to have people visiting us from other places, but here we are in this situation. As Dr. Beck said, my presentation today is Women's Rights are Human Rights, Activist Implementation of the Transnational Human Rights Framework Against Sexual Violence in South Korea. This study aims to examine the formation of violence against women policy in South Korea through the lens of the transnational women's human rights movement, exemplified in the institution of the United Nations and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women. This paper is going to be, this presentation is going to take two parts. So in part one, I will describe South Korea's key legislation on violence against women. And then in part two, I explain the processes by which these legislative changes took place using Sally Engel-Mary's framework of a transnational human rights system, which takes place in global settings and is then translated into local terms and situated within local contexts of power and meaning. And the role of activists is really key here as they serve as intermediaries between different sets of cultural understandings in the transnational and local spheres. So I will also provide further context by analyzing the institutionalization of the women's movement in South Korea. A note on definitions. Violence against women takes many forms, and I acknowledge that. And in this paper, I use a fairly narrow definition of violence against women, focusing on rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and digital sexual crime. So my focus here is on interpersonal violence perpetrated by men against women. It's not always of a sexual nature, and it does not necessarily involve physical contact. There's no standalone law in South Korea that addresses violence against women. Instead, a handful of separate laws deal with rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment, and digital sexual crime. So let's look at them. According to the Criminal Act, rape is defined kind of narrowly as penile vaginal only. And there's a lesser crime called imitative rape, which refers to like oral or anal penetration or a finger or something like this. And that is a lesser sentence, only 2 years of imprisonment minimum. So prior to 2012 revisions to the law, which made South Korean rape law gender neutral, any rape like of a man on a man or a female on female or a female to a man would be considered not rape. And then there's another category called Quasi Rape, which refers to when a person takes advantage of another's condition of unconsciousness or inability to resist. So basically this is applied when the victim is inebriated. Spousal rape or marital rape, which is rape in the context of a marital relationship, isn't defined as illegal by any specific statute, and South Korean society actually tolerated it for quite a long time. They had a legal precedent of a 1970 Supreme Court decision, which overruled a guilty verdict in a case of a man raping his wife. This changed in 2009. The Busan District Court convicted a 42-year-old Korean man of raping his 25-year-old Filipino wife and using weapons to threaten her. He was sentenced to a suspended 30-month prison term. That was the first time that the South Korean court had classified spousal rape as a crime. And he appealed, and in 2013, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's verdict. Sexual harassment is addressed in the 1987 Sexual Equality Employment Act, amended as the Act on Equal Employment. It deals with sexual harassment in the workplace only. It doesn't address cyber stalking or other public places. And according to women's studies scholar Young-hee Shim, the original 1987 Act was kind of just a declaration of sexual equality. It didn't have specific prohibitions, and it didn't have any definition of discrimination or of sexual harassment. Since 1999, it does. It defines sexual harassment at work as a criminal offense. And then additionally, the 2014 Framework Act obligates the heads of public organizations to implement measures to prevent workplace sexual harassment. Domestic violence and sexual violence are dealt with the Sexual Violence Prevention and Victims Protection Act in 1994. So that established the responsibilities of national and local governments to build and operate a system for reporting and investigating sexual violence cases. Then in 1997 came two major pieces of legislation addressing domestic violence. The Punishment Act defines domestic violence as activities involving physical or psychological harm or damage to property among family members. So that could be physical, psychological, or economic. Per the Criminal Act, these are all separate offenses with different degrees of punishment, and offenders may be sentenced to a maximum of 5 years in prison and fined up to 7 million won, which is about $6,400 USD for domestic violence offenses. And then the Act on Punishment of Sexual Crimes was enacted in 2010, and it prescribes special cases concerning the punishment of sexual crimes, for example, bodily injuries as a result of rape, indecent acts through abuse of occupational authority, and other kind of special cases. Digital sexual crime, which is not the main topic of this presentation, but is the main topic of my thesis, refers to cases in which perpetrators use cameras to record photos or videos without consent. And those have been taken in public bathrooms, saunas, escalators, subways, and private homes, hotel rooms. And then the material is sometimes disseminated through file sharing sites called webhards or social networking services like KakaoTalk or Telegram. There have been a number of recent high-profile cases in the last couple of years that have brought a lot of attention to digital sexual crime. To look up at your own risk, they're quite a lot to deal with. In 2020, the National Assembly passed a bill that made it a crime to possess non-consensually captured images. So previously, possession was not punishable, just filming and dissemination was punishable. And now possession can be punished with up to 3 years in prison or a fine of up to 30 million won. And just last year, 1 year ago, the minimum age of consent was raised from age 13 to age 16 in South Korea as a result of some of these cases that involve minors. So in this, the section I just went through, I explained the legislative changes in South Korea, and now I want to explain those changes as part of a transnational process in which global law is situated within local context of power and meaning. And here I rely on the anthropologist Sally Engle-Mary's work, Human Rights and Gender Violence, Translating International Law into Local Justice. She explores this movement from both the global and local levels. So what are human rights? Since the 1980s, human rights have gained international credibility and support, while a growing body of treaties and resolutions has strengthened their international legal basis. Human rights are now the major global approach to social justice, aiming to embed principles of individualism, autonomy, choice, bodily integrity, and equality into the law and embed the law into everyday social practices. The global human rights system is now deeply transnational. It takes place in global settings with representatives from national governments and non-governmental organizations around the world. Mary focuses on the International Institution of the UN, which is the central location for international deliberation and construction of the human rights frame. And then I also focus on the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which is an international treaty adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1979 and instituted in 1981. CEDAW is an international bill of rights for women. It emphasizes a vision of gender relation in terms of equal rights for men and women, and it explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. So states that ratify the CEDAW are obligated to take action to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. South Korea was the 90th country to ratify the CEDAW in December 1984. And let's look at the efforts of the women's movement to redefine violence against women as a crime. When the CEDAW was ratified in 1984, the South Korean women's movement had not been transformed yet into a feminist movement that was specifically looking at sexual discrimination and inequality. Rather, from 1980 through 1987, the women's movement wasn't focused on sexual violence. It was focused on issues of democratization, which really took precedence over women's concerns at that time. And the movement's relationship with the government was quite hostile, characterized by aggressive resistance against the military dictatorship. The women's movement at that time saw the state as an adversary to be defeated and replaced. Therefore, not much attention was paid to the CEDAW for quite some time until the 1990s, after democratization was achieved. The first CEDAW impact study consists of pilot reports from 10 ratifying countries. The report on South Korea was prepared by Young-Suk Cho in 1999, and she describes efforts of the South Korean government toward implementing the CEDAW And she concludes that those efforts were largely driven by the women's movement, not by the government. So the women's movement was leading, the government was following behind when they were pushed. Let's look at some of the strategies of the women's movement at that time. They made efforts to help victims in legal matters and to counsel them. They attempted to frame sexual violence as infringement of the right to sexual self-determination rather than a crime against chastity. And they actually drafted the laws that were eventually adopted in 1997. They interpreted between global and local spheres, which is central to Mary's analysis. Mary highlights the importance of activists who serve as intermediaries between the global and the local. Women's movements participated in a process that Mary identifies as localization of transnational knowledge. So they participated in transnational events and brought home what they learned. Throughout the 1990s, members of various women's NGOs continued to attend UN conferences and other international conventions due to the government's open door policy, the Korean government's open door policy at that time. And that period was characterized by a shift in the women's movement from working against the government to cooperating alongside it. The institutionalization of the women's movement has been an important factor in its success in pushing the state to enact legislation. The women's movement is considered to be institutionalized because of its achievement in the establishment and revision of women's policy, its expansion of social influence, and women leaders' entrance into institutional politics in the administration. Institutionalization of the women's movement is a pretty new development in South Korea relatively. So in 1993 to 1997, the Kim Young-sam administration was more willing to work with the progressive women's movement than the previous administrations had been. So that administration encouraged groups to register as incorporated bodies under the government. And women's studies scholars describe a heated debate within women's groups between registering with the government or remaining independent. So some thought that if they registered with the government, they could lose some of their autonomy, but ultimately many of them did register in order to gain legitimacy and receive government funding through grants. Engagement with the state has brought many victories, including the legislation that was passed in the 90s. It has also produced some unintended consequences for the women's movement. In some cases, working with the state meant that violence against women had to be framed differently than what feminists originally wanted. So in getting the Korean government to respond to the issue of violence against women, domestic violence, initially radical feminists rejected any engagement with the state due to the belief that the patriarchal state enforces and maintains all forms of male violence against women. However, more liberal feminists recognize that law and public policy play key roles in helping women maintain autonomy and in holding men responsible for their violent behaviors. So ultimately, activists decided that establishing anti-domestic violence law was a priority because they wanted to move the issue from the private sphere to the public sphere. So they had to kind of frame domestic violence as something that threatened the unity of the family and that threatened to break up families rather than this is something that violates women's human rights. And the way that was framed had consequences for ultimately the way that domestic violence is treated in South Korea. Despite the victories of the women's movement in getting legislation passed to protect women from violence, there is a gap between the law in the books and the law in practice. So if we think about spousal rape, as I talked about before, there's an inconsistency there. So the South Korean Human Rights Organizations Network noted that the Supreme Court's decision in that case was only because it involved a severe level of violence, threats, and weapons. And if it wasn't involving all of those things, maybe it wouldn't have been recognized as rape. And then another loophole in the rape laws is the legal defense of drunkenness. It's actually not a gap between law in the books and law in practice because it's written into the law. So let's look at that. In Article 10 of the Criminal Code, it says that for the conduct of a person who, because of mental disorder, is deficient in the abilities mentioned in the preceding paragraph, the punishment shall be mitigated. So what abilities is it referring to? Making discriminations and controlling one's own will. So this is invoked when someone commits a crime while they are drunk. And I want to look at an infamous case from 2008 that illustrates this. In 2008, a 8-year-old girl identified by the pseudonym Tae-Ung was raped and left severely injured by a 56-year-old drunk man. He had committed 17 previous crimes, among them rape and murder. She testified that her attacker smelled of alcohol, and because of that testimony, the man's life sentence was reduced to 12 years. She also suffered from secondary damage from the court proceedings, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So after the—
Would you please try to wrap up, Laura?
Yes, I will. So he was released after 12 years because he was drunk, and that still remained a defense. I'm going to skip over this one because of lack of time. There's also some concerns about defamation laws in South Korea, because sometimes the victims of sexual violence can be punished for making false accusations, even if what they're saying was the truth. South Korea's defamation laws are pretty strict, and sometimes they can be used to intimidate victims into dropping their complaints of sex abuse. Secondary damage refers to when someone reports a sexual crime and the police or investigators kind of just laugh at them or ask them, why were you doing that, or why were you wearing that, sort of thing. And that is a problem because it discourages people from reporting. And then some scholars are also concerned about the reduction of sentences. So just someone being put on probation or being ordered to undergo counseling, etc., which means that sometimes sexual crime is not dealt with very seriously. I'll come to my conclusion here. And I conclude that when translating the CEDAW from the transnational to the local, South Korean women activists confronted a patriarchal hierarchy. CEDAW and the global human rights framework did not always resonate with the cultural and political structure, the reality on the ground in South Korea. However, as, oh, I'm not done, I got one more. As Sally Engel-Mary says, human rights ideas like sexual autonomy and bodily integrity are more easily adopted when they do not disturb established hierarchies, but they're more transformative when they challenge existing assumptions about power relationships. And that is what has been going on in South Korea. Thank you so much for listening. And
thank you very much for the excellent presentation, Ms. Laura Becker. And she has done tremendously, comprehensive presentation, mostly focusing on criminal law dimension with regard to sexual violence in South Korea. In South Korea, actually, the effort to legislate non-discrimination act that covers not only criminal dimension but also other dimensions are still not successful. So there are a lot of things that we should cover in the coming years, and hope your research also covers some other non-criminal dimension as well with regard to women's rights and human rights part. But this is excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm very sorry to have a very limited time left at this stage, but because in our chat already we have a very excellent question from Professor Anna Sturr. So I'd like to ask Anna to shoot this question first, and then we may take one or two more later. Go ahead, please. Anna, are you there? Yes, I think so. Anna, do you hear me? Or if it's not, I will just read it. So for Mr. Yan.
Hello, hello.
Oh, you're here. Okay, very good. Go ahead, please.
Sorry. Sorry, did you read my question already, or did you want me to?
Not yet. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have
please summarize it. Only we have two more minutes to
really,
go.
for Mr. Yan, I wanted to know more about your concluding reference to how women would be able to enter the labor force more. I wondered if that was just for future research, or if it was more, if it was something you could speak to about comparisons between India and China.
Yes. Thank you for the question, and that's actually is a good one. Yeah, definitely that's one of the very interesting topic I'm going to continue to do in the future. And yes, to your question, because because in the past, in China, India, the woman play a major role in taking care of the elderly. But since based on because of the social and democratic change, we can see more and more women are relieved from the those unpaid care work in the family and in the household. So and then they can go to the city to seek the paid job. That, so we can see that in China, India, there are more and more women. They can participate in the job market. So that's what we that's what I can see in the female participation rate is increased in both countries. The only difference I observe is the number of the care workers in those two countries. Maybe it's because the biggest share of the care industry in India. So based on the data I have, I can see there's more women who participate in taking care of in the care industry, like taking care of the elderly in the long-term care facilities and hospitals, and that population is in India is bigger than is in China. So that's my observation here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. And we have one more question from Litika Ahuza. She is here. So, but Laura Becker has already responded some, but Litika, would you please speak, quickly summarize your question?
Yes, thank you. My question states that the presenter mentioned two words, transnational and global. So my idea, I do not have a clear idea of the difference between the words, so I asked about it.
Laura?
Yeah, thanks for your question, and it's a good one. So I think of global as being something like the global pandemic, something that's just present in many countries and many regions around the world, and we can say that the women's human rights movement is. And we can also say it's transnational, referring specifically to the movement between countries or regions. And in this case, the women's activists were moving the knowledge and the information that they took from the conferences and trainings back to Korea, and then they would teach the people in their own organizations about what they learned at the conferences.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I think we should wrap up with this. So I would like to thank again to all of the four speakers today, Elodie, Shibin, Arif, and Laura. You did tremendous good job today. And thank you very much for all of the audience and people who have asked questions. So this is the first session, so this will wrap up our first session, and I will send the floor back to Kimori and Hannah. Thank you very much.